So today I want to talk about hell. I want to talk specifically about the way people argue about it, especially on the internet. And so I'm going to address the secularist, the agnostic, the atheist, the whatever you want to call yourself, the non-believer, their arguments against the concept of eternal conscious torment in a minute. But before I get to that, the first thing I want to discuss is the way Christians tend to navigate this conversation. One is pretty often, actually, that I'll see is that the Christian will argue that even if the various, let's say, complaints or arguments against the concept of hell that a non-believer has are valid, that even still, that doesn't undermine, you might say, or it does not defeat the concept of a belief in God. That in fact, what the Christian will sometimes try to argue is that by complaining about God's decisions, specifically his eternal judgments, you're actually presupposing the existence of God, that you have to assume God exists before you can complain about his behavior, his decision-making, his judgments being good or evil, etc. And here's the problem with that. What the Christian is essentially doing is they're selling the store but trying to retain the goods. And what I mean by that is what the Christian is doing is they're just granting the person's disagreements as valid in order to dismiss the conversation. And here's the problem with that. When a non-believer, a secularist, an atheist, whoever is complaining about, arguing against the concept of hell, eternal conscious torment, what they are actually doing is that they are complaining about arguing against God's nature. They are saying that God is not good, that his judgment is not good, wise, or all-knowing, and that his essentially his decisions are not righteous. They're attacking God's character through the vehicle of one of God's decisions. And obviously, when a Christian simply grants those things as valid, even if the Christian disagrees, if they grant those things as valid, what they are doing is they are granting as valid the accusations against God's character, not simply the matters that are corollary to hell. And so when they say that that even if the non-believers' complaints about heaven and hell and eternal conscious torment, etc., are valid, what they're saying is even if God isn't good, even if God isn't righteous, even if God isn't all-knowing, that he isn't all-wise, that he isn't omnibenevolent, even if you have still not defeated the concept of God. And of course, what this ends up doing is this manufactures a much weaker form of God. It's no longer the ontological, necessary being that created the universe, that is all good and all wise and all righteous, etc. It's some lesser demiurgical being that is not actually the God of the Bible, that is not actually the God that Christians worship. And so if the Christian grants those complaints, which I'll get to in a minute, what ends up happening is that they then back themselves into a corner of having to defend a theological concept of God that they don't even necessarily worship. They end up having to defend something that is not even worthy of worship in a lot of perspectives. So they end up losing the battle without realizing that that is what has happened. So that's important. The Christian simply cannot allow or grant these complaints. You have to contend with them. You cannot simply bypass this conversation. So that's one thing. The next thing is that if you're a Christian and you want to contend on this battleground, specifically the concept of eternal destinations, you have to define terms. We have to lay out what is being discussed in terms of hell, eternal conscious torment. We have to decide, or we have to at least determine the foundations of what we are talking about. We cannot assume that the atheist, agnostic, etc. is thinking the same thing that we are when they're talking about hell, because the likelihood is they are not approaching the concept of hell in the way that it is described in Scripture, or even that has been believed in historically. The likelihood is their image of hell is something more akin to something that would appear in fiction. The likelihood is that they're thinking about a red-horned demon on a throne surrounded by licks of flame, and that demons are torturing people down there, and that Satan is the god of that realm and all this sort of things. None of those things are true. And unfortunately, there's a lot of Christians even that fall into this trap of that most of the theological conceptualizations of hell that people hold are actually the products of John Milton's Paradise Lost and Dante's Divine Comedy. They're not the things that are found in Scripture. And in fact, they're completely foreign to them whatsoever. So that the things that often are being discussed in this sphere are completely unimaginatively false. And so you end up kind of ping-ponging back and forth between the two of you, actually trying to defend or defeat something that is not even taught in Scripture or in historical doctrine. So it's very important to lay down from the outset, if a person is complaining about the concept of hell, what do they mean? What is it that they're actually trying to defeat? And is that a biblical concept or not? And that you as the Christian need to become fairly well versed in what does the Bible actually teach about this subject. If you don't know, then honestly what you probably should do is just say, I don't know. That's your best response. I don't know. Let's talk about this more. Let me read some books. So it's very important that we refine those terms. Do not take anything for granted. Do not simply secede to your opponent any, you might say, even ifs scenarios. Don't do it. Contend, but only do so rightly, wisely. So that's the next thing, because quite frankly, it's not going to be a very productive conversation if what ends up happening is the two of you end up disagreeing about the concept of hell that even Scripture itself doesn't defend. So, very important. And so let's start now with the ways that the secularist, the atheist, the whatever you want to call him, the non-believer, will often disagree with the idea of hell or be offended by the concept of hell. And I think the most common one is the idea that it's not fair. That it's not fair for a person to live their life being a good person throughout their days, or even some will say like living a life of suffering, let's say the Holocaust survivor or the whatever, living a life of suffering just because they didn't believe in Jesus, they end up going to hell. That's not fair. And the way I would respond to this, life's not fair. Life isn't fair. Why do you think that that is a valid disagreement? When you see a herd of zebras, if we want to see from usually their perspective, you want to, that it's more materialistic, right? The idea that if there's a herd of zebras, it's not fair which one gets got. It just happens. It's not fair that certain people are born disabled. It's not fair that certain people are born wealthy, etc. Like, life simply is not fair. They're using a standard to complain about God's judgment that simply does not apply to it. Fairness is, at best, wishful thinking. It's something that maybe we aspire to occasionally, but for the most part, it's illusory. It's not a thing that really exists. So that's my point. Like that. So who cares if it's not fair or not? And then I would actually push it even further that justice and fairness are often on antithetical points of the spectrum. That if you want everyone to be treated equally or fairly, you end up throwing justice out the window. People end up getting a lot of what they don't deserve, not getting what they do deserve. So if you want everything to be fair, you're not going to be very just. And that's another thing they'll say, that it's not just, that the punishment doesn't fit the crime, that it's not just or justifiable that you spend eternity in hell for just a few decades of rebellion against God, or not choosing to worship God, or worshiping, this kind of thing. And again, that first, who put you as the arbiter of what is and isn't justice? Who made you the arbiter of that? And this is kind of where it begins of like, you need to make them justify these claims. You can't just take them for granted. Who made them the arbiter of true, false, just, unjust? Because if you ask them, like, quite frankly, most people are not just. Their judgment is not sound. They are not wise people. So, who made them the arbiter of these things? And if they can pull something out of a hat and justify their perspective of them being the one that is best suited to be able to determine what is and is not just, even if they did that, now we have the question of, so what if exactly about hell, eternity in conscious torment, eternal separation from God, what exactly about that is unjust? And make them explain it. Don't take anything for granted. Make them explain it. And it'll often sound something like this, that it's too long of amount of time, that if you spend just a few decades here on the earth, why should you spend an eternity in hell based on even if you're the worst of the worst? Why? And the answer to that question is, it's all about proportions. That's what they're complaining about. It's too long. That most criminal punishments far outlast the deed done to earn that punishment. Whether it's maybe takes a few short minutes, clicks on a keyboard in order to steal someone's identity, or to whatever, something like that. It might take just a few minutes, but then that person goes to prison for years or decades. It might take just a few minutes of taking your eyes off of the road to change the radio station or check your text messages or something, and as a result you end up going off the road and hitting a telephone pole, or rear-ending someone's minivan or something, and causing end of a person's life, or drastic changes to a person's quality of life. A few minutes results in a lifetime of change of quality of life for someone. Is that equal? No. And that's the way a lot of these punishments are. That in fact, it almost never is equal in the amount of duration crime committed versus crime punished. They're always different in length. And that sometimes it's life in prison, sometimes it's decades, sometimes it's just years, sometimes it's just a few months of community service or whatever, time served. That they're never equal in length is the point. And that often what this specific line of reasoning leans towards is a concept called annihilationism, the idea that why doesn't God just cause people's souls to disappear. If they truly want to be separated from God and they don't want to worship him, then why doesn't he just cause them to cease to exist? Why does he prolong their existence in suffering? And I would ask the question of what's the difference? What's the difference between continuing to exist in hell and not existing at all? If both are separated from God, what's the difference? Meaningfully, what's the difference? And that if both are eternal, right? You ceasing to exist is obviously also an eternal solution to the problem of unjust people. What's the meaningfully distinctive difference between these two things, annihilationism and eternal conscious torment? What's the difference? Make them explain that. So, going on, the next thing is the concept of why is God sadistic? Is he evil? Is he petty? Like these kind of character assassination things. And to that, I would usually respond with that everyone has a list of people they would put in hell. If it's real, like we can assume it's real for just a second, everyone has a list of people they would put in hell. And sometimes they'll try to grandstand on this to create some kind of moral superiority, saying that even they wouldn't wish it on their worst enemy, but it's not true. It's not true. They can usually go backwards through history of different individuals. Maybe they disagree with them politically. Maybe they did some sort of atrocious acts in the past against different groups of people or something like that. Or maybe they did various things. Every person alive has a list of people. If hell exists, they would put them there. Why wouldn't God? If it's true, like let's just grant a few things for the sake of argument here. If it's true that God exists, he's all good, he's all just, etc., he's far more just than any mortal, limited human being is, why would he not have a list of people that belong in hell, that need to go there? And of course you can list off the spicy dictators and stuff from the past at the very minimum. Some people would say somebody like a political opponent that's alive now or that was alive in the past, maybe people that are guilty of certain things that are considered atrocities now, like let's say slavery or human trafficking or something like that. There's plenty of instances that a person would be more than willing to throw another human being into hell because of what they feel is justified deserts. Why would God not also have such a thing? And then we insert again here, who gets to decide who's on that list? God does, right? What if you're on it? What if you're on it? Because now we move in the direction of the next complaint of like, why is God taking so long? Why doesn't God just simply purge all of the evil from the earth so that hell doesn't need to exist? That there's no evil to punish? And the answer to that question is, sure, why not? But let's just say everyone would generally willing to admit that they're not perfect, right? They're not virtuously upright. So what if God decided he wanted to start with you or me? Are you suddenly now trying to skirt the line? No, like just give me enough time to have kids. Maybe give me enough time to let my grandkids grow up or something, and then do it, right? All of a sudden, it's not as important on our to-do list anymore if it starts that we're the one that's heading off the line. We want it to be someone else. There's a political concept called NIMBY, and it's an abbreviation, acrostic thing, for not in my backyard. That there's plenty of people in the world, in the United States of America, that are part of the voting populace that agree with various conceptual ideas, like the idea of wanting to have more solar energy, more reliance on native energy sources, renewable energy sources, wanting to have greater policing in the community, wanting to have, just whatever, except they don't want it built in their backyard. They want it built somewhere else where they don't have to see it. They don't have to worry about the birds being killed or the glare off the solar panels or the police cars driving through their neighborhood and ticketing and citing their bad parking jobs. They want it to be somewhere else, someone else that's affected by it, not themselves. In the same way, everyone's got their list of people they believe belong in hell, but of course, they're the ones, maybe sometimes it's narrow, maybe sometimes they'll try to pretend like they aren't vain and say that, well, we're just barely on the other side of the line, we're on the good side. But everyone assumes that if there's a list of people in hell, there's a certain group of people that are going, but not them, because they are a good person. They're decent, in spite of their many knowingful flaws. So, what this all comes down to is the fact that we're leaning in to the direction of proving that, first, the person who's complaining about this concept is at best hypocritical. At best hypocritical. At worst, simply blind. They don't know. Like, in a lot of ways, that they have a lot of double standards that they either haven't really confronted in themselves or that they are completely oblivious to. And so you kind of have to dredge those things up so that you can move in the direction of a gospel presentation. That's the goal on this. It's not to make the other person feel stupid. It's not to try to throw something in somebody's face. It's not to make yourself feel intellectual or to grandstand. It's not that. It's to give yourself an avenue to share the gospel so that you can show a person their flawedness so that their eyes can be open to their need of salvation. Because a lot of this stuff comes down to the idea that someone thinks they have righteousness, but in fact it's just self-righteousness. And so you want to expose that to them. The sins of pride and envy and wrath that reside in them that have deluded them into thinking things about themselves, about others, about God that are not true. Once you've exposed those roots of sin in them, try to reach for them. You don't want to be overly pushy and such like that, but just simply reach for them. See if you can't pull those things out just a little bit, maybe just a couple of inches, and just give them something to think about, of the fact that you're not a good person, you need salvation, you're not in a perspective to make these judgment calls, and that God is. That's one of the reasons why, as a Christian, we trust God to make those judgments. I know as a human, I'm not in that position, but that's why God does it himself. And that recognizing that the reason I'm not in that position is my own sinfulness, I need salvation from this thing just as much as anyone else. And that it's that peace that comes from Christ's substitutionary atonement that gives me the ability to talk about these things in a calm, collected fashion, in a sterile fashion, because I know I'm not touchable by it, because I know that I'm safe. I've been saved, is the language. And that the reason the person is so offended by the thing is they don't want to get caught in its jaws. That's really all it comes down to. The reason they're so offended by it is because they know they are a target. And so to make them realize that, and if you make them realize that, you'll have an opportunity to snatch one from its jaws. That's the goal.